On a windy Monday, two men in bright vests opened my back gate and strode across the grass toward the creek, claiming a path I'd lovingly mowed for 40 years as if it were theirs. One pointed at a tablet and coldly stated, "We've got an easement right here." I stood my ground, saying, "Not one I signed." They shrugged and continued on, dismissing my rights without a second thought. Subscribe to help one more person spot the red flags in time. I have always believed in the principle of forewarning. Trouble, like the bill collector or the first flecks of winter, ought to announce itself before it crosses your threshold. At 72, my ears don't catch the high notes much anymore, but they never miss the sound of a stranger on gravel. So when the back gate rattled open at exactly 4:32 p.m., I clocked it against the kitchen wall's big red hand. I put down my Sudoku, wiped the coffee ring from the Formica, and stood ready at the sliding door. The men who entered my field did so without the uncertainty of first-timers. They wore new vests the color of overripe oranges and the gait of men paid by the hour, not the acre. Their boots pressed deep into my spring sod, leaving mud divots across the precise lines I'd mowed just that morning. For 40 years, I'd kept that stretch from the fence post to the old bridge as close-cut as a putting green. Not for show, but because I liked the order of it. The sense that my world began and ended exactly where I said. The taller one, face shadowed by a cap branded with some blue telecom logo, held a black tablet up like a divining rod. He led the shorter, broader fellow with the easy confidence of a man following GPS. Neither slowed as they crossed the first 50 feet of my property, not when the wind gusted up from the creek and flattened their pant legs against their calves, not when the gate banged closed behind them, not when I slid open the glass and stepped out onto the porch with a simple, "Afternoon, gentlemen." They did not answer, but the taller man's eyes flicked once to me, cool and hollow, then back to his screen. Only when they reached the crest of the rise did he stop, plant one boot on the rusted water meter cover, and speak. His voice was smooth as drywall, nothing left to catch a hold of. "We've got an easement right here. Utility right-of-way, scheduled line drop." I watched them from the porch, hands pressed to the railing until the chill bled up through my palms and numbed the tips. There was a notary-stamped boundary marker set just 3 feet left of the meter, hammered in by my own father's hand in 1962, but nobody bothered to ask about history anymore. The shorter man made a show of consulting the tablet, then looked up at me with a professional blankness. "We're running a straight shot from the road to the next lot," he called, as if this was a favor I'd requested. Not for the first time, I wondered how many legal fictions could be printed on a municipal letterhead before the paper gave out. "That path's mine," I said, not loud, not angry, but plain enough. Always has been. The men regarded me for a moment. The wind whipped at their pant legs and played hell with the edges of their vests. Then the capman shrugged, a quick avian motion. "Not what the survey says," he replied, and started walking again. The short man followed, glancing once at the crumpled bag of dog waste I'd left near the trash can, then back to the crease of the earth. I let them go. There is a kind of injury in being ignored, a sharpness that outlasts the duller ache of insult. I waited until they'd crossed the low bridge, oak planks, sanded every spring and oiled against rot, before I stepped off the porch and paced the perimeter of their trespass. My boot tracks paralleled theirs, but where their stride was careless, mine counted every inch. I stopped at the meter. The ground was scarred by the tread of new soles. The sky overhead threatened rain but withheld. I studied the cloud cover, letting the gray press down until my shoulders rounded with its weight. The men had reached the far side of the property line and were conferring over a coil of blue plastic tubing, the kind that snakes underground and never comes up for air. From this distance, they looked less like violators than actors reciting their roles. There's a reason I never let the grandkids play in the back field unsupervised. A man's land is a living thing, but also a fragile one. A single indifference can leave a mark that outlives you. The men set to work, not even glancing up as I retraced my steps to the house. The gate was still ajar. I closed it and listened for the latch to catch. Inside, the kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Clock ticking, Sudoku half done, coffee cooling in its mug. But the world had shifted a half-inch off plumb, as if a nail in the frame had come loose. I stood at the window and watched them until the first drops of rain appeared on the glass. It was only then I noticed my hands were still shaking, not with anger, but with something older, akin to fear. Trouble hadn't knocked. It had let itself in. There is a calculus to staying put. 40 years on one patch of ground, and you start to think in root systems, not street addresses. Every corner of this property has a story, and every story has a cost. I have paid in years, in knuckle skin, and in the blank stretch of nights spent awake in the living room, waiting for some disaster to call my name. The place came to us in the late 70s, when interest rates ran high and my own optimism higher. The yard was a pockmarked acre, the house a jigsaw puzzle of additions and half-hearted repairs. I worked the graveyard shift at the elevator, caught overtime when the furnace coughed itself to death, and put every spare dollar into siding or shingles. My wife Annie never saw the point in grass you couldn't eat, but I kept it sharp, convinced that order on the ground would bleed into the rest of our lives. The creek that slashed the rear fence line was my first real battle. Erosion chewed up a foot of the bank every year, dumping black dirt and snake holes into the water below. The city claimed it was nature's way, but I'd be damned if I'd let my property be undone by a current. I planted river birch by hand. 20 saplings wrestled home from a nursery sale, and staked them one by one in the clay. It took 3 years for them to do any good, but by then I'd learned patience. Every spring, when the runoff threatened to claim another 6 inches, I'd walk the perimeter with a bucket of rocks and tamp them into place. Sometimes the ground gave in anyway, and I'd cuss a blue streak, but I never let it win. I built the footbridge with my son. It was supposed to be a one-day job, but Neil insisted on learning to use the level and the miter saw. We argued about the slope of the approach, the width of the boards, whether to stain it dark or light. In the end, we left it raw. The rain softened the edges, and the grain silvered in the sun. Neil doesn't remember the arguments, only that it was his idea to drive the first nail, and mine to carry him across once it was done. He was 5 then. Now his knees creak worse than mine. The yard's history is cataloged in my body as much as in memory. There is a scar on my left shin from the old metal slide that buckled in the tornado of '86. My thumb aches every time the air drops below 40, a souvenir from the post-hole digger incident. The shed is built from the bones of 2 earlier sheds, patched and expanded each time I found myself with an extra weekend and a pile of clearance lumber. I have replaced every fence post twice, sometimes 3 times, always in the hope that this time it will outlast the next storm. It was only when my grandson, Timmy, came to visit that I realized the true extent of my obsession. He was 6, allergic to grass but not to mud, and within 10 minutes of arriving, he'd managed to slip behind the garden shed and wedge himself into the creek's edge. He called to me, not in panic, but with the solemnity of a boy who knows the hierarchy of rescue. I found him standing ankle-deep in muck, holding a rock in one hand and a fistful of reeds in the other. "Pop," he said, "are there fish in here?" I crouched beside him, feeling the creak of my hips as I did, and dipped a hand into the water. The current was icy, more force than depth, and I watched the silt swirl around my palm. Minnows mostly. Maybe a catfish if you're patient. I scooped up a handful and let it pour through my fingers, the sunlight catching each droplet in a brief, perfect arc. "This creek's been running longer than either of us," I told him. It's our ribbon of silver." He liked that. For the next hour, we sat together on the bridge, my bridge, built with my own hands, and watched the water write its story on the mud. He asked about the river birches, and I told him how their roots kept the bank from washing away. He asked if they'd still be here when he was old. I said yes, if he wanted them to be. Later, when he was gone and the house was quiet again, I walked the property line in the failing light. I stopped at the birches, now thick enough to shade a man, and pressed my palm against their bark. The wind rattled the branches, and the sound was like applause, or maybe defiance. I have never cared much for the paperwork of life. Deeds and surveys and legal descriptions mean nothing to a flood or a storm. What matters is the work you put in, the battles you choose to fight, and the memories that stick to a place like burrs to a pant leg. Which is why, when those men with their vests and tablets trampled through my grass, it felt less like a formality and more like a wound. You don't spend a lifetime shoring up a piece of earth just to let someone redraw it with a stylus and a shrug. My attachment was not sentimental, though some might mistake it for that. It was stubbornness, maybe, or the conviction that a man is measured not by his achievements, but by what he refuses to surrender. At night, when the wind picked up and the creek's voice grew louder, I would lie awake and rehearse my defenses. Not in words, but in memories. The scrape of a shovel in rocky soil, the weight of my grandson on my knee, the familiar thud of boots on the footbridge as I made my rounds. These were the real markers, the true boundaries, and no surveyor's report could ever hope to capture them. I am not a religious man, but if there is a heaven, I hope it is built on land you've tended yourself, acre by stubborn acre, and I hope the fences hold, at least for a little while. The next day the men were back, this time accompanied by a white van and an unbranded pickup that parked itself sideways on my verge. I watched from the living room, arms folded tight across my chest, as they unloaded lengths of blue conduit and staked plastic flags into the wet ground. Every step took them closer to the creek, as if my objections yesterday had never happened. I pulled on boots, zipped my jacket, and walked the perimeter like a sentry. When I approached, the men fell into the practiced silence of workers who'd rather not explain themselves twice. The taller one, now bareheaded, thumbed at his tablet and announced, "You're getting a line upgrade. Full fiber, new install. We'll be done by Thursday if weather holds." He said it the way a nurse might tell you she's just doing her job, even as she tightens the tourniquet. "You say there's an easement," I replied, careful to keep my voice level. "Show me where it's written." He tapped at the screen, then handed it over like a menu at a bad diner. The map glowed with the precision of a drone strike, a thin blue line slicing straight through the rear of my lot. In the margin, under the header, Developer, I recognized the name of a company I'd seen on yard signs sprouting up across the county. There was a digital signature, something illegible, followed by a tidy stamp. Franklin D. Delaney, grantor. I felt the old tremor in my right hand, the one that sometimes makes the coffee slosh. I clamped my fingers around the device until the plastic creaked. "That's not my signature," I said, "and my name is Frank." The man shrugged, not unkindly, and took the tablet back. "We just dig where they tell us. Call the developer if there's an issue." He nodded to the van, where a third worker, no vest, just a ratty hoodie, stood watching us with the stony indifference of a traffic camera. The van's windows were tinted dark, a detail I could not stop seeing. I let them pass, but not before pulling my phone from my pocket and snapping photos of their badges, the license plate, the open document on the screen. Back in the kitchen, I set my phone on the table, pressed record on the voice memo app, and spoke the date and time into the air. Unauthorized entry by contractor. Easement claimed, not recognized. Suspected forgery of deed signature. My voice was steadier than I felt. The drawer next to the refrigerator held every paper worth a damn: property tax receipts, old warranty cards, and a battered manila folder labeled DEED in Annie's handwriting. I spread it open on the counter and paged through the layers. Plat maps, the original sale document, a single-page utility access agreement dated 1979, signed by the previous owner, one Samuels. I read every line twice. Nothing in there authorized a developer, least of all in my name, to carve up the back third of my property for a line drop. The world outside the window had gone gray, with rain streaking the glass in diagonal lines. I stood and watched the men for a while, measuring each motion against the pain in my chest. There was nothing careless about their work. They drove the conduit with a neat, surgical efficiency, so different from my own messy repairs and do-it-yourself fixes. There was no sign of malice, only the inexorable logic of a process set in motion far above my reach. I tried the county assessor's website next. The interface was built for someone with time to spare and patience to match. I searched by parcel number, then by address, then by owner. Each click brought a new PDF, a new legal abstraction of the dirt outside my window. After 30 minutes, I found it. 3 weeks ago, an access easement had been recorded for my property, referencing the very developer whose name appeared on the tablet. The grantor line was typed in full, Franklin Delaney, and beneath it, a digital signature rendered in black italics, smooth as forged iron. For a while, I just stared at it. The sensation was not anger, not yet, but something cold and shapeless, a sense of having been hollowed out. I printed the page, stapled it to the front of the deed folder, and sat with my hands folded tight across the countertop, squeezing until the tremor stopped. The word easement looked wrong on the page, as if someone had dressed it up in borrowed clothes. It wasn't mine. None of this was mine. For dinner, I made boxed macaroni and ate standing at the sink, the rain tapping a private Morse code against the glass. When darkness came, I circled the house twice, then locked every door. Upstairs, I spent an hour combing through old emails for anything that could explain the recording. Nothing. No notice, no request, no paperwork in triplicate. The next morning, I took my car to the nearest legal office, a glass-fronted building in the newer part of town. I told the woman at the desk that I needed to speak to someone about a fraudulent document. She gave me a form and asked for my driver's license. The act of spelling my name aloud felt strange, as if reminding the world I still had a claim to it. In the waiting area, I watched a couple with matching Bluetooth headsets argue over a closing cost, each scrolling their own devices in silence. I resisted the urge to pull out my own phone, but I did anyway, rereading the PDF until the lines blurred. When my name was called, I stood up too fast and had to steady myself on the chair. The lawyer was a young woman, dark hair pulled back so tight it made her eyes seem larger. She introduced herself as Priya, then asked me to start from the beginning. I told her about the men, the tablet, the signature that wasn't mine. She listened without interrupting, only pausing once to ask if I had ever granted power of attorney or signed anything online. I told her no, and that my computer passwords were all in a notebook in my desk. She nodded, jotting notes. "It's increasingly common," she said, "especially with remote closings and electronic notary services. But it's a serious issue. If the document is fraudulent, we'll need to move quickly. First step is to file a notice of fraudulent conveyance, then get a temporary restraining order against the developer and the utility." She handed me a list of documents she needed and told me to bring them in the next day. I drove home with the radio off, the only sound, the rattle of the dashboard, and the persistent thump of my heart. In the kitchen, I made coffee and sorted through the required paperwork. The deed, my last utility bill, the letter from the developer I'd never received. I placed them in a neat stack, labeled each with a sticky note, and set them by the door. It was only after all this that I let myself feel the anger. It arrived late, like a thunderstorm that holds off until the evening, then breaks all at once. I paced the house, fists balled, rehearsing conversations with the men in vests, with the developer, with whoever had the nerve to forge my name. I imagined confrontations, showdowns at the gate, even a lawsuit that would drag their names through every local paper. But anger has a half-life, and mine burned out by midnight, leaving only the old ache of loss and a wary readiness for whatever would come next. I climbed the stairs to bed, passing the framed photos of Neil, of Annie, of a boy with mud on his knees and a fish in his hands. In the dark, I listened for the sound of the creek beyond the window. It ran on, steady and indifferent, carving its own channel through the world. For the first time in 40 years, I did not feel entirely at home. The legal office had no windows you could open, only the illusion of light diffused through glass panels and the humming of a filtered air system. At 9:37, I checked in at the desk, repeating my name for the third time in 24 hours, and was sent to a waiting area that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A potted plant in the corner drooped like it knew something I didn't. At 9:40 sharp, a woman in a navy blazer and wire-rimmed glasses stepped out from the back, introduced herself as Priya Narang, and motioned for me to follow. Her office was small but orderly. No loose files, no family photos, just a laptop, a yellow pad, and 2 matching pens aligned on the desk. She gestured for me to sit, then perched herself on the edge of the seat opposite. "Let's build this out step by step," she said, clicking a pen with practiced certainty. "You have your documents?" I slid the folder across the desk. She paged through it with quick, efficient hands, pausing only to underline dates and scribble question marks in the margin. She wore her hair pulled back in a way that made her jaw look sharp, and when she looked up at me, her eyes didn't blink. "You're positive you never signed anything for them? No digital forms, no DocuSign?" I shook my head. "I don't even pay my bills online. I like a paper trail." "Good," she said, and for the first time there was a flicker of approval. "That helps." She set the documents down and folded her hands. "Here's where we start. First, I'll order a title search to confirm your deed is clean and see what, if anything, is on file for this developer. Then we file a notice of fraudulent conveyance with the county. That'll serve as a public record that you dispute the document's authenticity. We'll also file a lis pendens, that's Latin for suit pending, which legally ties up the property until a judge reviews the case." She spoke with the certainty of someone who'd done this 100 times, yet there was no comfort in it, only the dry click of one process slotting into the next. "What about the work they're doing now?" I asked. "If they finish, doesn't that make it a done deal?" She shook her head. "Not necessarily. We'll draft a cease work and no entry letter today. It will be delivered to the developer, their contractors, and the utility company. If they cross your property line after that, it's criminal trespass, and I can call the sheriff directly. But you'll want to document everything, photos, times, even your own notes. The more we have, the better." She turned to her laptop and began to type, hands flying over the keyboard. "I'll have the letters out by this afternoon. You'll need to sign affidavits confirming your signature was forged. When the title search comes back, we'll have our next step." I watched her work, feeling the old discomfort of being out of my depth. I've always been at home with the tangible, saws, shovels, the smell of new-cut wood. Here, everything was digital or abstract, but the process was a kind of craft, too, I supposed. Priya's every motion was measured and deliberate, every word chosen with an economy I could respect. She finished typing, printed 2 letters, and handed them to me for review. "Read these carefully," she said. The language is strong, but it has to be. If you're satisfied, I'll have you sign at the bottom, then I'll notarize. The first letter was addressed to the developer. It read like a warning shot, citing the code, the statute, the date of the disputed filing. The second was for the utility, demanding an immediate halt and referencing the pending legal action. I read both twice, savoring the firmness of the words. I signed. Priya stamped them with a small, circular notary embosser, pressing hard enough that I could feel the ridges through the paper. She collated the copies, stapled each packet with precision, and placed them in a folder. "Keep these on you," she said. "If anyone from the contractor or developer shows up, present the letter. Document everything." She leaned back, finally letting the chair's backrest take her weight. "We'll build a timeline and give the court something heavy to hold," she said. "Move slow, speak plain, keep paper. That's how you win these." The weight of it all pressed on my chest, heavy and unfamiliar. I looked down at the folder in my lap, the legalese and seals and stiff bond paper, and realized that I'd just armed myself for a war unlike any I'd fought before. I thanked her and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "How long does it usually take?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses, considering. "Months, sometimes longer. Depends on the court's calendar and how aggressive the other side wants to play it. But once the lis pendens is in, nothing can transfer or be recorded without your say-so. You've bought yourself time, at least." In the lobby, I shuffled the documents in my hands and tried to imagine what Annie would have said. Probably something about fighting fire with fire, or maybe about the difference between justice and fairness. The front desk clerk smiled at me as I left, and I nodded back, more out of obligation than warmth. Outside, the sky was cloudless, and the sun reflected off the hoods of parked cars with a hard metallic glare. I drove home slowly, the folder belted into the passenger seat like a child. At a red light, I looked down at the notary seal and traced the raised lines with my thumb. Back at the house, the workers were gone, but their flags and conduit remained. I walked the length of the easement, phone in hand, snapping photos every few feet. The wind had scattered some of the flags, and I bent to collect them, tucking the plastic into my pocket as if reclaiming a piece of my own DNA. Inside, I filed the letters in the kitchen drawer, then poured a glass of water and sat at the table. The light through the sliding door cast a precise shadow across the laminate, dividing the room in two. I sat on the darker side, the folder heavy in my lap, and waited for the next step to announce itself. Justice, I realized, was not a moment of triumph. It was a process, slow, meticulous, and utterly lacking in drama. But it was better than doing nothing, and for now, that would have to be enough. Subscribe and share one line you wish you'd heard earlier. Someone will borrow it. By noon the next day, Priya called with the results of the title search. Her voice on the phone was crisp, businesslike, but with an undertow of urgency I hadn't heard before. "The easement paperwork was submitted electronically," she said. "The grantor packet, the one with your so-called signature, was emailed from an address belonging to your son, Neil Delaney. Do you know anything about that?" I nearly dropped the phone. Neil was my only son. He helped me set up the email account years ago, and sometimes used it for sharing family calendars and forwarding old photos. But I had never signed anything digital, and certainly not for him. "Could it be a mistake?" I asked, already knowing it wasn't. "Unlikely. The document metadata shows the origin, timestamp, and IP address, all traceable. The signature line is an e-signature, very generic. I'm sending you a PDF now. Tell me if it looks like anything you've signed before." I opened my email on the laptop. The signature was blocky, too even, the kind of thing a machine does when it's never seen your hand shake. Underneath, the name Franklin D. Delaney, appeared in a typeface I would never have chosen. Priya's next email outlined the next steps. She'd already filed for a temporary restraining order to freeze any work on the property until the judge could see the fraudulent signature herself. She'd also requested a handwriting comparison using my bank's signature card. She said she'd need to subpoena the records, but it would be straightforward. "We need to get the property surveyed," Priya added. "I've scheduled a surveyor, Kent Matheson, good reputation. He'll set boundary markers so there's no ambiguity about where the lines are." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I answered calls from the courthouse, my bank, and even the sheriff's department, who said they'd received Priya's letter and would be increasing patrols in the area. It was all happening too fast, and not fast enough. Neil called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. "Hey, Pop, call me when you can." Nothing else. I deleted it without listening to the rest. The next morning, Kent the surveyor arrived just before sunrise. He was a heavy-set man in canvas overalls and steel-toed boots, with a surveyor's tripod and a battered orange Transit that looked older than him. He spoke little, but nodded with respect when I introduced myself. We walked the property together, starting at the corner pin on the east side. He checked the old marker, then drove a new stake in beside it, tagging it with a strip of bright orange tape. "You can't miss it now," he said, voice graveled from years of cigarettes. "I'll run the line straight through to the rear." "Want to walk with me?" I did. We traced the imaginary line, stopping every 20 yards for him to drop a flag or drive a stake. He made notes in a small spiral-bound pad, occasionally muttering about good soil here or shale close to the surface. When we reached the creek, he pointed at the water and said, "This is the natural boundary. Anyone tells you otherwise is selling something." He finished by the bridge, where my grandson and I had once watched the minnows swim. He drove the final stake deep, double-wrapped it with tape, and stepped back to admire his work. "Looks right," he said. "I'll file the report with the county and send a copy to your attorney." "Should hold up fine." I thanked him, and he gripped my hand in both of his, squeezing with a strength I'd forgotten men still had. "Don't let them push you around," he said. "Most people, they just roll over. Glad to see you standing up." After he left, I walked the perimeter again. The orange tape caught the sunlight, fluttering in the breeze like warning flags on the edge of a battlefield. I took photos of every stake, then printed them out and taped them to the kitchen window, a visual record for anyone who might try to claim otherwise. That afternoon, Priya called with more news. "The judge granted the TRO. Nothing can be done to your property for at least 2 weeks, pending a full hearing. I've scheduled a handwriting analysis for Monday. If the developer pushes back, we'll have more to go on." Her certainty was infectious. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Not the wild young man's hope of fixing a broken thing with a hammer and sweat, but the measured, stubborn hope of someone who'd survived too many winters to trust in easy outcomes. In the evening, I sat by the sliding door, watched the wind work through the birches, and let the orange flags comfort me. I wondered about Neil. I wondered what would make a son do such a thing, or if he even knew what had been done in his name. But that was a question for another day. For now, the property was marked, the boundaries clear, and my name, real and true, stood where it always had, on this stubborn patch of ground. Thursday morning broke cold and clear. I woke with the sun and brewed coffee strong enough to burn through the haze that had settled on my head the past few days. On the kitchen table, the orange flags from the surveyor's line were laid out side by side, each one a small promise that the world still made sense if you marked it out carefully enough. At 8:17, Priya called. "We have the order," she said, and I heard the satisfaction in her voice for the first time. "The judge signed the TRO this morning. I'll send you the PDF for your records. The document arrived by email before I'd even hung up the phone. I printed it on the brightest paper I could find, a leftover ream from Annie's scrapbooking days, and took it out to the gate, along with a heavy-duty zip tie and a no-entry sign I'd bought at the hardware store years before and never used. I fixed the order and the sign to the chain link, tightening the plastic strap until my knuckles ached. The sign was neon yellow, the kind used for foreclosures or biohazard warnings. It looked out of place against the battered old gate, but I liked the message it sent. For a while I just stood there, watching the sun catch on the plastic and the wet grass below. The workers were gone, the equipment stripped from the field. Even the blue conduit had disappeared, leaving only shallow ruts in the earth where the van had parked. I made a lap of the property, then another, feeling lighter with each step. I stopped at the bridge and leaned on the rail, letting the cold air sting my face. The creek ran a little higher than usual, the water dark and quick, but it stayed within its banks. For now, at least, the boundaries held. Back inside, I called Priya to thank her. She listened, then said, "Don't celebrate yet." The developer's lawyer called. They say they'll voluntarily pause the project pending the hearing. But I want that in writing. I'll forward the email when it comes. It arrived less than an hour later. A terse, two-sentence message from a firm in the city, agreeing to halt all activity without prejudice until the court could rule. Priya annotated it, attached the judge's order, and CC'd everyone involved. The paper trail, she said, was the fortress we'd build our case around. I printed the emails and filed them in the kitchen drawer, under the folder labeled DEED. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the wind chase the last of the surveyor's flags across the yard. For the first time all week, I allowed myself to believe I might win. I stayed there a long time, letting the silence fill the room. Outside, the neon sign on the gate blazed in the sun, bright and impossible to ignore. It was a small thing, but sometimes a small thing is all you need. That night, I set the phone on the countertop, hit record, and invited Neil to sit at the kitchen table. He came in wearing his work clothes, khakis pressed too sharp for real labor, and settled into the chair with the caution of a man expecting bad news. I'd lined up the evidence along the laminate, the printed PDF of the forged easement, the TRO order in neon, the photo of the surveyor's orange flags staked across the lot, each piece a marker, a boundary for the conversation. "Pop," Neil said, voice thin, "I got your messages. You said it was urgent." I slid the deed across the table, let it settle in front of him. "You recognize that email address?" I asked, pointing to the metadata Priya had highlighted in yellow. He glanced at it, then at the kitchen window. "It's the family one. I use it for the calendar mostly." He touched the paper with 2 fingers, like it might burn him. "I don't know anything about this." I didn't reply, just watched him. After a moment, I slid over the survey photo, the flags bright against the green. Neil's eyes darted between the evidence and the mug of coffee I'd poured him. "I told them it was just access, Dad. Not a big deal. They said it wouldn't matter since nobody actually lives back there." "They?" I asked, steady. He shrugged, uncomfortable. "The guy from the developer and the realtor. They said everyone does digital signatures now, and it's easier to process if I what?" He looked down, cheeks flushing. If it was just handled." He risked a glance at my face. "I thought maybe it was a clerical thing. Not like you'd ever sell, right?" I stared at him, and the silence stretched out. For a second, I saw the boy who'd once begged to build a treehouse, who'd never finished a chore without asking if he'd done it right. "I never signed it," I said, the words heavier than they ought to be. He nodded, looking at the mug. "I'm sorry, Pop. I really am." But it's just a line on a map. Doesn't change anything, not really. I took a sip of my own coffee, let the heat work through my chest. It matters enough for a judge, I said. And it matters here. I tapped the bridge photo, the one where my grandson's feet dangled over the edge. This is what I'm trying to protect. Not the paperwork, the history. Neil looked up at me, eyes ringed with fatigue. I know. I do, He shook his head. Things are different now, Dad. Nobody gets to keep anything forever. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched the way his hands curled around the mug, how he kept his voice even, almost professional. We sat in the quiet, the only sound the hum of the fridge and the wind working at the sliding door. The phone on the counter recorded it all, every pause and shift in tone, a record for posterity. After a while, Neil stood to leave. He looked at the evidence again, then at me. "What now?" he asked. I shrugged. "Court hearing. Maybe more." He nodded, then reached for the door. "Let me know if you need me for anything," he said. And I believed he meant it, in his own way. When he was gone, I saved the recording, labeled it Neil Convo, and filed it on a USB drive next to the kitchen radio. Then I poured out the cold coffee, rinsed the mugs, and lined them up to dry. In the dark, I walked the perimeter again, stopping at each orange flag, touching them as if they were talismans against forgetting. The wind was up, but the tape held. Inside, I turned off the lights, sat at the table, and tried to remember when trust had last felt easy. I slept with the sliding door open a crack, listening for the sound of the creek, the bridge, the boundaries holding. They always had, until now. On Monday, the title company's examiner sent a report in plain language. The easement is voidable. The reasons stacked up like bricks: mismatched ID, notary failure, no evidence of in-person verification. The conclusion was as simple as it was final. Recording does not meet legal standards. Grantor's intent unproven. The county clerk's email came the next morning. They would flag the document pending a judge's ruling, and nothing would transfer or be built until the court issued its decision. A week later, Priya called with the news. "Judge Martinez voided the recording," she said, voice crisp with satisfaction. "The developer's lawyer didn't even try to fight it. They'll reroute the line through their own frontage, and the utility agreed. It's over." For a while I said nothing, just listened to the silence on the other end. "Congratulations, Mr. Delaney," Priya added. "You did everything right." I thanked her and hung up, then poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window. The neon no-entry sign was faded now, dulled by the sun and rain, but still there. The creek looked unchanged, the birches leafed out in their new green. 2 days later, Kent, the surveyor, came back. He worked in silence, pulling the orange flags and stacking them in a neat coil. When he finished, he tipped his hat and walked to the gate, leaving the ground unmarred. The wind that day was warm, carrying the first hint of summer. I walked the property twice, as if making sure it was all still there, then sat on the bridge and watched the water run. The tension in my shoulders eased for the first time in weeks, replaced by something quieter, lighter. I thought about Neil, about what he'd tried to do and why. Maybe he saw the land as an asset, not a memory. Maybe he thought he was helping, or maybe he just wanted to move on. I would never know for sure. But the boundaries held. And for now, that was enough. In the evening, I sat on the porch with the windows open, listening to the creek and the wind in the birches. The house was still, the property whole. I let myself believe it might stay that way, at least a little while longer. After the ruling, I made a point to gather everything: deed, court order, surveyor's report, even the copy of the neon sign, and put it all in the old fire safe I kept under the basement stairs. It was a small act of protection, maybe superstitious, but it felt right. I wrote Neil a letter. Not an email, but a real letter. 3 pages in longhand. I told him the dates, the filings, what I'd learned about online notarization and digital signatures. I made it plain that the land was not just acreage or asset, but something I intended to leave whole. I ended with a line about Sundays at 2, that he and his family were welcome for dinner as always. But that discussion of the property was off limits unless Priya was on the line and every document was on the table. I slipped the letter into an envelope and mailed it myself at the post office, waiting in line behind a man with a stack of birthday cards and a woman sending a care package overseas. The clerk gave me a commemorative stamp without asking, and I liked the way it looked. An American kestrel, bright and sharp, clutching a boundary wire. The next Sunday, Neil showed up with his wife and son. We ate roast chicken and mashed potatoes, then watched the little one chase dandelion fluff through the yard. Conversation stayed light. Weather, school, baseball. No mention of signatures or surveys. When they left, I walked the property one last time before dusk. The orange flags were gone, replaced by the flicker of robins in the low branches. The air smelled of river and cut grass. I paused at the gate, closed it behind me, and listened for the click of the latch. Inside, I set my glasses on the table and checked the locks. I still misplaced them more often than I liked. But as long as I had the safe and the land and my name clear on both, I figured I could live with the rest. There are worse things than holding your ground. Sometimes, it's the only thing that keeps you upright. I went to bed with the windows open, the hush of the creek drifting through the house. This time I slept without waking. If any of this rings true, subscribe and leave one sentence, the boundary you'll set this week.